Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the first webinar session of 2019. And today we are looking at Japanese knotweed management. My name's Katie. I look after the IT and digital infrastructure here at CABE, and I'll be acting as your moderator for this morning's session. So we do like you to get involved with our webinars, and the way you can do that is on your screen, either on your right-hand side or at the top. You will have a little question box, and what you can do is you can send in any questions to us. Just type those in at any point during the session and they'll pop up, and we'll be able to look at those as we go along. What we'll look to do is do a Q&A session at the end of the actual presentation. So again, feel free to, as anything pops into your mind, drop a question over to us. You can also still send us questions if you're watching this on perhaps our YouTube channel. Just email those over to us at info@cbuild.com, and again, we'll pick those up and get back to you. If you're on Twitter, you can join in #CABECPD. So this morning, your presenter is Dr. Peter Fitzsimons. Now, he's Technical Manager at the Property Care Association and responsible for all matters relating to invasive weeds, especially Japanese knotweed. He has worked as a research botanist and in the property repair market, and has homeowners' interest in the role of biocides in the built environment. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hand over now to Peter, so just bear with us a couple of seconds, and then Peter will take you through this morning's session.
Is there anything else I should be doing? Has that got my screen up for you, Katie?
That's it. That's there. All over to you now.
Thank you very much. Get rid of that toolbar. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning for what I hope will be informative, educational, and entertaining half an hour or so of discussion about Japanese knotweed. I know that within our audience today, there will be a number of people who are already very experienced in the world of Japanese knotweed, and for those, I hope certainly that there will be a useful degree of refreshing your knowledge about some aspects of Japanese knotweeds that you might have forgotten about. For others of you, this all might be a little bit new, so I've tried to pitch the information at a level that's appropriate for everybody. So let's just get into it. Slides moving, that's it. So this is just a quick slide to confirm that my name's Peter Fitzsimons. I'm the technical manager for the invasive weed group here at the Property Care Association. Katie's already explained that I've got a bit of a plant background. Started life doing a bit of research in universities before moving on into the area of herbicide treatments and then later on into the property care market. So I've got a fairly broad spectrum of experience in relation to both weed control and property care. Hopefully any questions that you pitch to me, I'll be able to drag some information out of my memory to cope with them. So let's move on. Let's just look at what we're going to be covering this morning. First of all, we need to familiarize ourselves with Japanese knotweed, discuss the botany of the plant, what makes it such a special plant with unique characteristics, and why it's become so problematic in the UK, the whole of Europe, and rest of the world outside of its natural range. We want to look at the scale and scope of what we see as the problem of Japanese knotweed today, and ask ourselves the question how the situation we have today came about and what we can do to control the plant in the future. We'll go on to talk about the legal controls associated with Japanese knotweed. There's quite a bit of legislation that's been passed over the years, specifically requiring individuals and organizations to control Japanese knotweed on their land and other invasive species. But we'll also look at some common law principles that apply to the nuisance effects of Japanese knotweed. There have been some recent cases which have been given us useful clarification about the status of the law as far as Japanese knotweed and nuisance claims are concerned. And then from a practical point of view, we'll talk about surveying Japanese knotweed, making sure that we understand the scale and scope of the plant's distribution in each individual situation where it's found, and the control measures that are available to us in order to ensure that properties can have their mortgageability is protected and maintained going forward in the future. We'll talk about the specific issue of warranties, which is a very important aspect of Japanese knotweed. There's quite a lot of DIY knotweed control going on in the world today. But the important thing about professional management strategies is that once the contracts are completed, that warranties can be issued, giving people confidence about reoccurrence of knotweed going forward in the future. And then, as Katie said, we've got a question and answer session at the end. So please, as we go through, you can post your questions at any time, and we'll try to go through as many as we can at the end. So here's the Latin name for Japanese knotweed, Falloppia japonica. In actual fact, it's got lots of other pseudonyms or synonyms. But botanists like to play around with these things, so as time goes by, the Latin name might change a little bit. But Japanese knotweed is a classic invasive species. In Japan and parts of China and Southeast Asia, Japanese knotweed is a natural part of a healthy plant ecosystem. So it occurs in balance with all of the other plants that occur in those environments. And it has a number of natural pests in terms of fungal disease, insect and other predators. So it's kept in control. It's more successful in some areas than others. In actual fact, in Japan, it's particularly well adapted to colonize quite harsh environments, such as the sides of volcanoes. And this gives you a bit of a clue as to why it's such a hardy, robust and difficult to control plant. One of a lot of the characteristics that Japanese knotweed has evolved to make it successful in those environments are its ability to grow very fast. It spreads very rapidly once it's established, either from seed or root rhizome material. Once it's established on the ground, it can produce a high percentage of light screening through its canopy, so excluding the opportunities for other plants to get established in the same area. And thirdly, once it is established, if there's any disturbance of the ground, obviously in areas where there's volcanic activity, you can get fresh lava flows or eruptions which will disturb the plant. Very small pieces of the root material are able to self-germinate. Vegetative propagation is a very strong part of its ecological adaptation to survival in those environments. And all of these features make Japanese knotweed very successful within its own natural ecosystem. And once it was introduced into Europe back in the 19th century, it was able to utilize all of these features to get itself established not only in people's gardens or parklands or botanical collections, but also to spread into areas where it wasn't particularly wanted. The large main reason for the extensive spread of Japanese knotweed, we believe, has been largely due to people disposing of soil containing Japanese knotweed rhizome root material without really fully considering its ability to recolonize ground purely on the basis of small amounts of root material which has not been successfully killed off. So, the final main reason for its success as an invasive species is the lack of natural predators. Outside of Southeast Asia, there are no insect pests which can use Japanese knotweed as a food source. And there have been some attempts to introduce insects from Japan, which might be able to naturalize and get Japanese knotweed in balance, at least in the wild. But unfortunately, these introductions so far have not been successful, and further research is going on in that area at the moment. So let's just move on and have a look at some pictures of Japanese knotweed that help to confirm these points. Here on the left-hand side, you can see a fairly well-established stand of Japanese knotweed. First of all, you'll notice that where it's occurring, there are absolutely no other plants growing underneath the canopy. And you can see that it's extremely well adapted in terms of the way that the leaf orientation is distributed, so that a huge amount of sunlight impacting on that canopy is being intercepted and very little light is getting through. And I think if you look at the slide carefully, you can see that there is sort of a multi-layered canopy structure there, so that as it's growing from, say, 1 meter to 2 meters to 3 meters in height, more and more of the light is being captured and screened out. So, and on the right-hand side here, we can see that Japanese knotweed tends to produce a fairly high stem density as well. So as the root material spreads through the soil, shoots are produced at fairly frequent intervals, so that the leaf orientation and the high stem density together mean that Japanese knotweed, once it's established on a piece of land, very quickly becomes the only thing capable of growing there. We'll look at Japanese knotweed identification characteristics in a little bit more detail later on, but I think you can see even from these pictures there's quite a distinctive leaf shape, often described as shield-shaped leaves. They are typically anything up to the size of the palm of your hand, and but obviously this varies a bit depending on the time of year and how healthy that particular stand of knotweed is. So how widely distributed is it? Well, I think you can see from the map of the UK on the right hand side here that there aren't very many places where Japanese knotweed is not found. In fact, the only places are those that are either peat bogs or over 1,000 meters in montane sort of landscapes. These are obviously, these are 10 kilometer squares on this map. Even if we had a 1 kilometer square map, we'd probably find exactly the same distribution pattern. Just if I can explain, these two slides here are from an app which you can download from app stores, and it's called Plant Tracker. It's sponsored by the Environment Agency, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and so on, and is actually a useful tool for people to use, whether you're an invasive weed surveyor or otherwise. And so that if you ever find an invasive species, obviously Japanese knotweed and or other ones, we can see Himalayan balsam and giant hogweed on here, then you can just use the app and the GPS on your phone to record the location of the plant, and that's just helps us to keep tabs on the distribution of all of these problematic species. Obviously, with Japanese knotweed, to some extent, the map is already pretty much filled in, so new data points aren't going to change the picture very much. But there are a number of other invasive species of interest. We'll talk about those a little bit later on, for which more data is required, and where new observations of their distribution, either in the wild or in the built environment, are of value and of interest. So let's just move on then to talk about looking for or finding Japanese knotweed, particularly in the built environment, which I think is the main interest for most of you listening in this morning. Just a few slides here, which I'll talk through. I mean, obviously the slide in the top left here, you can see this is not an untypical situation where we find Japanese knotweed present in a garden close to a boundary wall of a garden, and it's grown through and into a fairly well built and robust stone wall there. And over time, obviously, can cause a lot of problems with the expansion and swelling and shrinkage of the root system and so on. So Japanese knotweed, does thrive well in brownfield sites and in the built environment in general. So its intimate proximity with masonry structures such as this is not that unusual. But if we look at the slide in the bottom center, this is just a more detailed slide showing you the leaf shape and pattern. Not only is the leaf shape quite distinctive with that very severely cut off flat leaf base, but if you look at that stem, you can see that there's a zigzag pattern there, which is pretty characteristic for Japanese knotweed. But I think the main thing is, in terms of the things that you might mistake for Japanese knotweed, most of the species which look a little bit like Japanese knotweed are woody plants. So Japanese knotweed is not a woody plant. It produces hollow canes, sometimes described as bamboo-like, but they're not hard or woody like bamboo or trees or shrubs. And they are hollow. So if you have some substantial stems, then close inspection of those will also help with identification. The main problem with identifying Japanese knotweed is that it's relatively easy when you get into May, June, July, August, September, and so on, because the plants, when they're mature, do have very distinctive leaves and other characteristics. The problem is that for 6 months of the year, it's either not growing at all. You can see on the bottom left there, just some dead canes, which are the remnant of the previous year's growth of Japanese knotweed. And you can see on the floor, there are a lot of canes that have fallen over. Those would have been the canes from previous years, which have been blown over by the wind, because they will just decay and rot eventually and fall down. So these canes, can themselves be diagnostic from an identification point of view, but they might not be that easily recognized by a non-expert. You can see the picture in the center, top center, showing these dead canes in a little bit more detail. And also what we call the rhizome crowns, which can just erupt just above the surface of the soil. And as the canes fall off, these crowns usually have exposed hollow stems of dead canes sitting on the surface. So where a knotweed stand is fairly mature, you'll see a lot of these knotweed crowns just lying on the surface. And then on the right-hand side here, you can see some Japanese knotweed, which is just breaking bud in, this would be, sort of late April time. And obviously you can see the leaf shape is a little bit more difficult to see what the leaves will look like when they're fully unfurled. But that red speckling on the stem that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner is a very useful diagnostic for Japanese knotweed when it's first germinating in March, April and May. And obviously, the time of year that it will get to various stages will depend to a certain extent on the climate in a particular part of the UK that you're in. Obviously it's going to be at a more advanced stage in the southwest of the UK, say in late March, early April. Whereas it might be late April or into May in the northeast of Scotland before it really gets going. So what should we remember about Japanese knotweed? Well, we can see already from some of the slides I've shown you that Japanese knotweed is a fairly prodigious, fast-growing plant. It produces a lot of green material above ground. It dominates the landscape where it grows. But in actual fact, the most interesting thing about Japanese knotweed is the bit that we can't see. And what we must remember always when we're looking at what we can see above ground is that we need to also use our imagination to see the plant below ground as well. The root system associated with Japanese knotweed must be mapped alongside the shoot system. So when any plans are being prepared showing the presence and distribution of Japanese knotweed around a property or in a brownfield site or in the wild, then what you would typically see is an outline of the shape of the stand of Japanese knotweed, and then another dotted line or coloured line a few meters away from that, showing the extent of the spread of the root system. Now, in codes of practice, including the Environment Agency Code of Practice and our own, we do say that Japanese knotweed can spread up to 7 meters away from the edge of a stand that you can see above ground. And there are circumstances, certainly, where that can and does occur. But typically in normal soils or in environments where there are no masonry structures impeding the spread of the rhizome, it's much more normal to find the rhizome spreading between 2 to 4 meters away from the plants. And this is just a natural part of the plant's biology. It's constantly pushing out these rhizomes below ground to try and extend the area that's being colonized by the plant. So why is Japanese knotweed a concern in the built environment? We know that it has this very high growth rate, and I've already alluded to the fact that it's a relatively difficult plant to control. It's difficult to control partly because of the point I just made about having a very extensive root system. So irrespective of what approach that we take to try to remediate Japanese knotweed, we're either going to have to excavate a large volume of soil because of the extent of the spread of the root system, or we're going to have to try and use chemical methods of control, herbicides. But these herbicides need to be taken into the plant and spread some quite long distances below ground into the root system in order to become fully effective. And we'll talk about that a little bit more detail later on. It's an invasive species, as we've already said, and unfortunately this means that it doesn't respect property boundaries. So this is one of the biggest concerns about Japanese knotweed, is that if somebody has it on their property and if they're prepared to manage the plant, there isn't a legal imperative to get rid of the plant. So you're merely required to control its spread. But thereby lies the problem. And if Japanese knotweed occurs anywhere in a property and it's close to a boundary with neighbouring properties, then it's almost inevitable that the knotweed will spread into those neighbouring properties unless very special measures are taken, indeed. And this is quite an important legal issue in terms of the nuisance impact of Japanese knotweed, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There are some structural impacts of Japanese knotweed. We saw a slide earlier on showing how it's able to grow into and around masonry structures. But most of the structural impacts that we see on a regular basis are those for drives, pathways, tar macadam, thin concrete surfaces, patios, maybe greenhouse spaces, this type of thing. That is to say, it's able to grow through these masonry structures relatively easily. But that the foundations of buildings, largely because of the depth of the foundations and the loads on them, are not normally disturbed by Japanese knotweed. So there's some been research done on this. We'll talk about it in a minute. But another thing to think about with Japanese knotweed, as I said before, is we've got to worry about the root system. It's very extensive and very aggressive. And that drainage systems around properties can often be invaded by Japanese knotweed roots. And we've certainly seen plenty of cases where drains have been blocked and or cracked and damaged by Japanese knotweed roots. And just remember, the big concern about Japanese knotweed is extremely small parts of the rhizome system, the root system, have the ability to regenerate. So we have to be extremely careful about how we manage wastes arising from Japanese knotweed, particularly if we're excavating or removing the plant. So just to continue that theme then, why are we concerned about Japanese knotweed? Clearly, for all the reasons mentioned, it has a financial impact. And the main financial impact is that where it's present, it may have an impact on the mortgageability of properties. And as a consequence, mortgage lenders have imposed schemes whereby they require vendors who have Japanese knotweed on their property to meet various conditions before they will release a mortgage to a purchaser. This is largely the underlying reason why the Property Care Association created its invasive weed control group, so that we can help the mortgage lenders to put in place schemes to manage Japanese knotweed effectively and with confidence going forward. Also, there are some restrictions imposed on insurance cover where Japanese knotweed is present. I shan't dwell on that at the moment. The important thing to say is that certainly as far as valuation surveyors are concerned, they have a duty of care when carrying out their surveys to make sure that they are looking for and taking care to detect the presence of Japanese knotweed on properties, because obviously it's an important factor in terms of overall valuations. We'll look at their information paper 27/2012 in a second in a little bit more detail. During the house buying and selling process, the Law Society have introduced a vendors questionnaire. It's part of the environmental assessment of properties, a form TA6, which includes a specific question regarding whether the vendor is aware of the presence of Japanese knotweed on their property, and if so, if it's being effectively managed. Let's look at the ICS guidance on Japanese knotweed. This is quite an extensive information paper. It's no longer available, to the best of my knowledge, as a download, because the RICS are no longer making these information papers available. But nonetheless, since 2012, they've had a formal framework in place for risk assessing knotweed, and this is defined in terms of its proximity to properties and or boundaries. They have 4 risk categories, 3 and 4, where there is an imperative for further investigations to be carried out, a detailed survey, management plans to be put in place, and risk categories 1 and 2, where the Japanese knotweed is further away from the property or not in close proximity to boundaries, and where further investigation may still be required, but it's less of an imperative. So we've talked a lot about the importance of Japanese knotweed and the impact it has on property value, and a large part of the reason for that is because there has been a presumption going back many years that Japanese knotweed can and does cause structural damage to buildings. This was actually put to the test recently, and a publication came out in the summer. It was a joint project between one PCA member, Leeds University, and a number of other RICS and PCA members contributed to the survey. And the survey results suggested that physical impacts of Japanese knotweed in the built environment are fairly common. Obviously, it was a limited survey, but quite often, in up to a third of the cases that were reported on, where Japanese knotweed was present, it was seen to be causing some physical disturbance of the built environment. Now, as I said earlier on, this is largely driveways, paths, shallow foundations, patios, possibly drains, this type of thing. But then they went on to look with this research at some properties which had been affected by the presence of Japanese knotweed for at least 10 years, probably longer, all of which were in Yorkshire area. And although it was a relatively small number of properties, they did report that despite the presence of Japanese knotweed, they couldn't see any direct impact on the buildings caused by the plant, and certainly no more impact than was found due to the presence of things like buddleia, for example. So the conclusions of the research were that, yes, we do need to be concerned about Japanese knotweed. It's an invasive species. It spreads very rapidly. It's difficult to control. It can cause a lot of disturbance and disruption. but that each site does need to be individually assessed. And we also need to consider other invasive species, particularly Buddleia, for example, within any property condition survey. Here's just a few slides just to emphasise the fact that Japanese knotweed does cause disturbance to buildings. I think some of them are self-explanatory. The one on the top left, if I can just explain, obviously we have two scenarios with Japanese knotweed, one where it's present in and around existing buildings, and other situations where sites are being developed, buildings are being built over land which was previously colonized by Japanese knotweed. And this picture on the top left shows the potential problem that can arise if Japanese knotweed rhizome material is not fully removed from site before building works commence. So this is an extension which is built on the back of a house, and literally within the first year or so of the extension being built, you'll see that the rhizome material which had been covered over by the new building works was able to germify. There's always going to be cracks and conduits through which Japanese knotweed can grow, and it's very good at finding those. But all these other slides show typical examples of Japanese knotweed becoming established in areas. It's not uncommon to find, if you look at the bottom left, obviously difficult areas to get at are often the last ones for the Japanese knotweed to be controlled. So obviously there's a narrow gap between the buildings there, and that's why the Japanese knotweed has succeeded so well there. But it's a nice demonstration of the height to which Japanese knotweed can grow, well over 3 meters in that particular case. So let's have a quick look at the legislation then, the legal framework for Japanese knotweed. There's quite a lot to get through here. Just very quickly, Wildlife and Countryside Act does two things. First of all, it passes legislation which gives protection to vulnerable species like bats and dormice and so on and so forth. But Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act also lists plants which are deemed to be pests. So invasive plants, and Japanese knotweed has always been on that list. Basically the Wildlife and Countryside Act requires people to avoid planting Japanese knotweed or otherwise causing it to spread to the wild. So what we're saying here is that Japanese knotweed in and of itself it's not, you're not breaking the law by having it on your land, but you would be breaking the law if you weren't actively managing the plant to avoid it spreading either through its root material or especially into neighbouring areas which might be vulnerable. Sorry, I should have made a point earlier on, by the way, which is quite important, which is that Japanese knotweed plants are all clonal. So we believe that every single plant that's in the UK has originated from the same plants that were brought in by the Victorians. It's a female plant. It's a dioecious species. They have male and female plants. These female plants successfully flower, but because there are no male plants around, it doesn't set viable seed, and so it doesn't spread through seed dispersion. So really the main control mechanism for Japanese knotweed is to control the roots and shoots, which can spread vegetatively. We've got the Environmental Protection Act, which is important because all wastes arising from Japanese knotweed excavations, etc., are deemed to be control waste and need to be carefully managed and taken to licensed landfill sites. There is actually a limit on landfill site availability. So there are a number of bits of research going on about ways of managing knotweed waste arising to reduce the volume of soil going to landfill. We have the Food and Environment Protection Act, which basically covers the use of pesticides. So we have strict control over the types of products that can be used for controlling Japanese knotweed. It's very important that before starting any works, that the products that are being used have on-label approval for use against Japanese knotweed. And some products are only approved for use in amenity sites rather than in domestic or residential properties. So very important to check all of the necessary approvals are in place before starting to treat knotweed with herbicides. And then finally, we have another Act of Parliament, the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, which is important because in areas where knotweed is not being managed by landowners, it is possible for a community of property owners to seek a notice requiring them to act to control the plant, because obviously it has financial implications in terms of its nuisance effect. In fact, there are some recent test cases which are worth reviewing here. You've probably all heard of Network Rail. It was much publicised in the news during the summer. A couple of gentlemen in South Wales took Network Rail to court because Network Rail were deemed to be failing to manage knotweed on an embankment, a trackside embankment, and it was impacting on their properties quite severely. The county court in South Wales found in their favour and awarded damages, which included, to a certain extent, some financial diminution. But Network Rail appealed, and when it went to the High Court, the original judgment was upheld, but for quite a different reason. And in the High Court, they said, yes, the case is a good case, but not because of the loss of value, but because of the loss of amenity. So that the property owners were no longer able to develop their land, build on the side of their property, extend their patio, because in order to do so, they would incur costs associated with controlling the knotweed and possibly even removing soil before they could lay foundations and so on. So a very interesting case, and I do recommend that you look that up and read it in detail, because it's quite an interesting example of how the nuisance effect of Japanese knotweed is viewed by the courts. Yeah, perhaps later on, if you send some emails in, or if you want a link to that High Court ruling, I can give it to you. And under the Community Protection Notice orders, one of these was issued recently by Bristol City Council against MB Estates Limited, and it was the first invocation of that act in the case of Japanese knotweed. Quite a large fine was imposed against this landlord for failing to act when a number of adjoining properties in that part of Bristol were being adversely affected by knotweed. So quite interesting clarifications of the law in those two cases, which helps us going forward to understand the instruments that can be used to help people who are affected by knotweed. So controlling knotweed, we have two approaches. We have potentially excavation, which is usually the approach we use on development sites, but it can increasingly be selected for domestic products, as you can see on the right-hand side. You know, even in residential areas, sometimes the excavation, if somebody wants to build an extension on the back of their house, for example, sometimes excavation is the only viable way forward to allow that work to go ahead. It can obviously be relatively high cost, quite intrusive process, and we have this problem of limited landfill capacity. But the upside is that it is relatively quick and is really the only option available where development is to be considered for that site. The alternative to excavation is to treat with herbicides. Fortunately for us, the non-selective herbicide glyphosate is quite effective against Japanese knotweed, but it does need to be applied systematically over several seasons. It's a lower cost route, but don't forget that a control program involving spraying can take typically 3 to 4 years, possibly 5, 6, or 7 years, depending on how mature the stand of knotweed is to begin with. So treated areas need to be left undisturbed during any guarantee period because the root system remains in the soil, albeit that it's been killed or put into dormancy by the spray treatment program. But that if any development work is anticipated in the future, we do need to think about excavation. So because the rhizome is still present, yeah, we do need to think about, you know, in the longer term, what its remaining potential is to regrow in the future. But unfortunately, at the moment, that's still a little bit of a mystery. We do know that dormancy can last up to 20 years with these quite long timescales, and we're still developing our understanding of that. So this is just an example of herbicide treatment, quick slide showing some foliar spraying, but stem injection is an alternative as well. You can see the equipment there on the bottom right hand side. There are pros and cons of both approaches. They are both very effective. And just very quickly, I think I'm overrunning by a minute or so. I'm just going to give you a couple of quick slides about the role of the PCA in the Japanese knotweed industry. First of all, we've set up qualifications and assessments of competence for surveyors and treatment operatives so that we can carry out knotweed management effectively and with confidence. We have our own financial and technical standards for membership, which need to be met and are audited on a regular basis. We check both companies' administration and record keeping systems, their compliance with all relevant health and safety legislation, and we have a code of ethics which all of our members need to comply with. We also put a lot of effort into education and training and the publication of guidance, particularly our code of practice for the control of Japanese knotweed. We run regular training courses which are extremely popular, together with associated exams, not just for Japanese knotweed, but for invasive plants in general. So we have qualifications, professional qualifications for both surveyors and technicians, and we continue to extend our guidance notes which are all open access on our website. And as and when required, we can provide specialist advice via our technical panel. We're not just all about Japanese knotweed. There are other invasive species we need to think about. Himalayan balsam isn't known for causing any structural impacts, but it's extremely important in terms of its impact in the wild. There's a lot going on with research on Himalayan balsam. I haven't got time to cover it today, but let's just say that obviously we need to take note of it where it occurs in the built environment as well. Perhaps more important in the built environment are some of these guys. Now, none of these on this slide are actually listed under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, but they are all capable of causing structural impacts because of their either their root system, in the case of horsetail and bamboo, which again is rhizomatous, or in the case of buddleia, its propensity for germinating and growing in masonry structures. And obviously buddleia being a woody plant can cause direct physical impacts as well. So we're very interested in these things too, and happy to take questions about them. So just a quick summary: Japanese knotweed can cause significant reductions in property value due to its ability to spread rapidly and disrupt gardens and homes. It can be controlled, but either the root system needs to be entirely excavated or the plant requires long-term management by spraying. Often, Japanese knotweed has been self-managed by owners, so the evidence of its presence can be somewhat hidden and difficult to interpret. Japanese knotweed controls require a thorough understanding of legislation and careful, systematic management by qualified contractors. Mortgage lenders usually demand Japanese knotweed management plans are conducted by contractors able to offer insurance-backed guarantees. There's a lot of research going on, and we're always looking to improve our understanding of Japanese knotweed control and its impacts in the built environment. Thanks for listening. Let's move on to the Q&A.
Thank you, Peter. So this is your opportunity to send in some questions. I know Peter's just going to have a quick look through and see which questions have come in, because I can see there's now quite a few. So yeah, this is your opportunity based on the presentation that you've just seen and heard. If you've got any questions for Peter, please do type those in. But have you picked up the questions, Peter, to find in for answering?
Yeah, no, I've got them here. Thank you very much, Katie. I guess I should just take them in chronological order, I guess.
Yeah, I'll let you lead, so feel free to answer them as they've come in.
Okay. Yeah, I've got a question here from, sorry, I think that's Garrido. And the question is, can Japanese knotweed spread just by a forward leaf on a boot being dropped on the ground? The answer is no, because a leaf in and of itself is not able to propagate vegetatively. But a part of the stem material, which includes at least 2 nodes, so usually we're talking about, say, 5 to 10 centimeters in length of stem material, can regerminate if it falls on the ground. But more important is the root material, any rhizome, and don't forget the rhizomes can be very close to the surface of the soil and easily disturbed and picked up on boots and so on. A small piece of rhizome material, just a few grams in weight, less than a centimetre or so in length, is enough to start a new infestation of Japanese knotweed. So not a leaf, but any small parts of stem or root material can cause a new infestation. When we had a stand at Chelsea last year, we talked about all the routes by which Japanese knotweed can be spread. And obviously just spreading on the boots of people inadvertently walking through Japanese knotweed areas is just one of them. Thank you to Dr. Chris George. He's asked this question: in controlling Japanese knotweed, which is more successful, inserting chemical into the cut-off stem or systemic application of spray to the leaves in full growth? He says that his personal experience is that the former, that stem injection, is not so effective, and that the latter takes 2 or 3 years. Well, certainly in case of the latter, yes, that's absolutely right, Chris. Spray applications of a glyphosate-based herbicide to Japanese knotweed can sometimes be quite effective with just one spray. So to a certain extent, it's about timing, it's about using the right product at the right application rate and so on. Sometimes you can just be a little bit lucky with the weather conditions, and all of these things can have an effect on how successful a spray treatment is. But generally speaking, knotweed rhizome is very extensive in the soil. So even if there is quite a big impact of a 1-year spray treatment, it usually takes 2 or 3 years before no growth at all occurs, and then a knotweed contractor would normally require another 2 years of no growth at all before starting the warranty period. As far as stem injection is concerned, I'm sorry to hear that your experience is that it's not been as effective as spray treatment, but I have to say that my own discussions with contractors who've used both systems is that stem injection can and does work very well. There was some research done at Swansea University which more or less backed that up. So I'm not quite sure what happened in your particular case. But I think over the years there have been lots of different products on the market for treating Japanese knotweed. Some of them were clearly more effective than others. And I think as time's gone by, we've got a little bit more knowledge and understanding of which products work well. And any experienced Japanese knotweed contractor, many of whom do use stem injection, will be able to back up their specification with their own personal experience and commercial knowledge of the treatments. Sorry, I'm just looking at something here. Okay, we've got another question here. I'm surprised the RICS do not publish the Japanese knotweed advice. Do you mean it's not available unless one is a member of RICS? No, if I can just explain that the RICS information paper has been widely available for many, many years. So that's at least 6 or 7 years now. But that what I mentioned earlier on about it no longer being available is due to a recent change in RICS policy regarding making published guidance notes, information paper documents available. They're changing their strategy a little bit in terms of the information they provide. But I would say, in answer to that question, that if you want any advice at all about Japanese knotweed management, then certainly our own code of practice is a good starting point. And if you want any further information at all, then please do contact us, and we'll try to help you. Just moving on, sorry. I have a question here. I work in an architectural office and would like to know where I can find guidance for myself and staff regarding best practice if Japanese is found on site. So a good starting point, as I say, is our own website where you can download our code of practice and other guidance notes regarding specific aspects. There's also a book that we've published recently, which is more widely based subject matter about invasive species in general. There are lots of, in our code of practice, you'll see lots of references for identification guides, field guides for Japanese knotweed identification and management. So yeah, so if you wish to find guidance regarding Japanese knotweed, please do come to us in the first instance, and we'll help you out and point you in the right direction. Next question, what do you do with excavation material? Well, first of all, what you do is you handle it with care. One of the most important aspects of a Japanese knotweed excavation is that it absolutely must be managed by a competent, experienced and qualified Japanese knotweed surveyor who fully understands the potential for even very small amounts of soil which may contain Japanese knotweed rhizome to cause a problem. The management of the soils arising from a knotweed excavation has to be done with a lot of care. The excavation material is all controlled waste under the Environmental Protection Act and needs to go to a licensed landfill site. And not all landfill sites will accept Japanese knotweed waste, so this is something that needs to be covered by the excavation contractor. There are other options with excavated material. If the situation allows, you may be allowed, after you've notified the Environment Agency, to create a burial cell on site. But obviously, if you've got a development site and you have the land available, then that's great, but that's not always possible. Another option is to create what we call a bund, whereby the excavated material, rather than being disposed off site, can be just built up in an area where, first of all, obviously we would spray the plant material before excavating it, so the knotweed rhizome already has some herbicide in it to reduce its potential for growth. And then if we create a bund on site, the idea there is that we would then allow the Japanese knotweed to regenerate, as it will do in time, and then we can manage the Japanese knotweed in a controlled way going forward in the future. So it's not an absolute imperative that knotweed excavations, arisings need to be removed from site, but that is often the only practical way of managing it. Just time for a few more questions, I think. The wildlife, it says here, the Wildlife and Countryside Act is most frequently threatened legislation. Are you aware of any examples of its use in relation to Japanese knotweed? That's a really good question. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. There's an awful lot of legislation around, including health and safety legislation, which is very clear in terms of what the requirements are, but we don't always hear about prosecutions. One thing I did hear recently, this wasn't in relation to Japanese knotweed, but I did hear that there was a successful prosecution under the Wildlife and Countryside Act relating to the disturbance of bats during a development project. But in actual fact, the Environment Agency decided to prosecute under the Proceeds of Crime Act, and without going into all of the details, they found that to be quite a successful way of ensuring a successful prosecution and making sure that the financial penalties were proportionate to the offence. So I think there are sometimes some problems with the Wildlife and Countryside Act, both in terms of achieving successful prosecutions and the sort of fines and everything that are possible under that act. And I'd be happy to talk to you later on via email if you want to discuss that in a bit more detail. Just time for a couple more, I think. Would the same legislation be suitable for use in the Republic of Ireland? Yeah, in the Republic of Ireland, obviously they have a completely independent legislature, but there is a very similar framework for the control of Japanese knotweed in Ireland to the one that we see here in the UK. It's slightly different in some respects, but the fundamental recognition of the potential impact of Japanese knotweed, both in the wild and in the built environment, is there, and there is already a large number of specialist companies set up to deal with the Japanese knotweed. The interesting thing about Ireland, just as an aside, is that the climate there is particularly attractive to Japanese knotweed. The parts of the UK which seem to be the worst affected by Japanese knotweed are the southwest of England and South Wales, and certainly the slightly wetter, slightly warmer climate does seem to help Japanese knotweed to a certain extent. And so it has become quite a big ecological and commercial problem in Ireland. So yeah, there's a similar legislation there, but it is subtly different. But we have some contacts with companies who operate in Ireland if you would like some further advice. Just moving on. There's a question here, says, what depth would need to be excavated to remove the root system of established knotweed? Yeah, very good question. Sorry, I did talk about the lateral spread of the rhizome system, but I didn't actually go on to talk about the extent to which it grows down. Again, we say that it could be up to 3 meters. Now, that's not a definitive maximum. It's just, sort of typically a worst case scenario, but it depends an awful lot on soil type and, the circumstances in which the plant is growing. And the availability of water supply. And like most plants, I mean, in many respects, Japanese knotweed is just another plant, and it behaves like a lot of other plants, and it will tend to use its energy to produce roots which penetrate very deeply into the soil when there is a limit on the availability of water. So it needs to go further to find water, but up to 3 meters seems to be the maximum. But in a typical Japanese knotweed excavation, what we tend to find is that 1.5 to 2 meters is by more a typical average. There's an interesting question here, might be the last one I can take. Do we know if pigs might eat the roots or rhizomes? I was thinking that some foraging animals might provide a potential solution in some locations. Yeah, there's lots of articles on the internet about sheep grazing, goat grazing. I've not come across one about pigs grazing. Most of the grazing is of obviously the green material. Clearly, there's more than one way to control Japanese knotweed. But unfortunately, all of these ideas don't result in any kind of definitive solution to the problem. It's just really managing the knotweed rather than controlling or eradicating it. So I think we're very close to, it's about 9:01 now. So I think, Katie, that's probably the last question I can take.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for taking all those questions because they were coming in thick and fast. What I will say is if you have submitted a question that Peter hasn't got round to, they will be available to him after the session. So I'm sure he'll follow those questions up with you directly. So we'll still cover off any questions that you did have. So yeah, as Peter said, it's reached 9 o'clock, and as you know, we tend to allow an hour for these sessions because obviously I'm conscious you've all got a busy day ahead. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to Peter for his time this morning and for the presentation, which I hope you all found really interesting and improved your knowledge on the area of Japanese knotweed and sort of other invasive species. So our next webinar is on Wednesday the 13th of February, and for that one we are looking at energy retrofits for housing. If you've not already signed up and it is of interest to you, you'll get an email shortly after this session, and there'll be a link for you to register at that point. Today's session has been recorded. It will be placed upon our YouTube channel, so if you need to refer back at any time, you can grab the content from there. Alternatively, if you've got any colleagues who may benefit from this morning's session, again, feel free, please do share the link. Excuse me, share the link with them, and then they can watch it in their own time. So, like I say, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Peter, and we will see you online again next time. Take care.